I stood at the edge of the graveyard, my black shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. My hands folded the way I had trained them to be, still, respectful, invisible. That was my role. Invisible. The wind moved gently through the tall trees, carrying the scent of fresh soil and white lilies. A long black coffin rested beside the open grave, polished until it reflected the gray sky above. Margaret's sky. Her family stood closer to the coffin, dressed in tailored black coats and designer sunglasses, murmuring soft condolences to one another. I stood apart, not because I didn't belong, but because they had decided I didn't. I was the maid, the help, the woman who had cooked Margaret's meals, brushed her thinning silver hair, held her hand when she cried at night, and stayed awake during her final breaths. Yet none of that showed on my skin. All they saw was a black woman in a plain black dress who didn't look expensive enough to stand beside them. I heard the whispers before I saw the looks. Who invited her? Isn't she staff? Why is she standing so close? Each word slid into me like a thin blade, not sharp enough to kill, but deep enough to hurt. I kept my eyes lowered, not because I was ashamed, because I had learned long ago that dignity, when worn by women like me, made people uncomfortable. My name is Ruth Jackson. I'm 56 years old, and I worked for the Whitfield family for 32 years. Margaret Whitfield wasn't just my employer. She was the woman who hired me when my husband died and I had 2 children and no safety net. She was the one who trusted me with her secrets, her medicines, her grief. When her own children moved away, busy with their lives, their companies, their parties, I stayed. I stayed when her hands began to shake. I stayed when her voice softened. I stayed when she forgot names but never forgot mine. "Ruth," she would say, smiling weakly, "promise me something." "What, Miss Margaret? Promise me you won't disappear when I'm gone." I had laughed then. I didn't know she meant it the way she did. The pastor cleared his throat. The service began. Words about legacy, generosity, family values drifted over the graveyard like smoke. Margaret's children nodded solemnly. Her son Edward dabbed at dry eyes. Her daughter Claire stared at her phone when she thought no one was looking. I watched silently. I had seen them cry before, not for her, but for themselves. When it was time for guests to step forward and say their final goodbyes, the line formed quickly. Designer shoes pressed into the soil. Soft sobs, rehearsed speeches. I stayed where I was. I knew better. But then Claire turned. Her eyes landed on me. Sharp. Annoyed. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for others to hear. "This is a family moment." The conversation stopped. All eyes turned to me. Heat rushed to my face. I just wanted to pay my respects," I said softly. Edward scoffed. "She was the maid," he muttered. "Not family." Laughter followed. Quiet, polite, deadly, someone whispered, "How embarrassing." Another voice said, "They always overstep." Always, I wanted to leave. God knows I did, but my feet wouldn't move. Because Margaret was lying there alone, and if I left, she would be buried without the one person who had never left her side. So I stood, silent, humiliated. The coffin was lowered. Earth hit wood. Thump, thump. Each sound echoed inside my chest. I bowed my head, tears slipping down my cheeks, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be human. That's when Edward leaned closer to Claire and said the words that changed everything. "Once this is over," he said, "make sure she doesn't come back to the house. We won't need that kind around anymore." That kind. My hands trembled, not from fear, from memory, from everything they didn't know, and everything Margaret had planned. As the crowd began to disperse, a man in a gray suit approached the family. He held a leather folder. He looked serious, professional, out of place. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I need everyone to remain for a few moments." Edward frowned. "What is this about?" The man glanced at me, then back at them. "This concerns the reading of Margaret Whitfield's final will." The whispers stopped. The air shifted. And for the first time that day, I felt something other than humiliation. I felt the ground preparing to move. If this story already has your heart racing, like this video, subscribe to Black Diamonds and stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know. The graveyard shifted. Not physically, but emotionally. People who had been whispering seconds earlier suddenly straightened their backs. Sunglasses were removed. Phones slipped quietly into pockets. Faces rearranged themselves into expressions of polite interest. Money recognizes opportunity faster than grief ever does. Edward cleared his throat. "Can this not wait?" he asked, irritation masked as sorrow. "We're still burying our mother." The lawyer, Mr. Havorson, didn't flinch. "I'm afraid it cannot," he replied calmly. Mrs. Whitfield left explicit instructions that this portion be addressed immediately in the presence of all listed parties. "All listed parties?" Claire echoed, glancing around as if expecting someone else to appear. Her eyes slid past me. As if I wasn't standing right there, I remained still. I had learned the power of stillness long ago. When you are invisible for decades, you learn how to occupy space without asking permission. Mr. Havorson opened the leather folder. The sound of paper unfolding felt louder than the clods of dirt still settling into the grave. "I will keep this brief," he said. "Mrs. Whitfield believed strongly in clarity." Edward nodded smugly. "Mother always did." I almost smiled, because Margaret's version of clarity was very different from her children's. "The Whitfield estate," the lawyer began, "includes the primary residence, 2 vacation properties, various investment accounts, and personal holdings." Claire's jaw tightened slightly. Edward's fingers flexed. I saw the calculations begin behind their eyes. "The estate will be divided according to the directives outlined in this document," Mr. Havorson continued. "However, before distribution, there are conditions." Conditions? That word landed differently. Edward frowned. "What conditions?" The lawyer looked directly at him. "Conditions of character." A ripple passed through the crowd. Edward laughed lightly. "That sounds like Mother's flair for drama." I lowered my gaze. "Margaret didn't do drama. She did precision." Mr. Havorson turned a page. "Margaret Whitfield required that each beneficiary be present today not merely as an heir, but as a witness." "A witness to what?" Claire snapped. The lawyer's eyes moved slowly, deliberately, and rested on me. "To the truth." I felt the weight of every stare shift. I could almost hear their thoughts forming. "Why is he looking at her? She's just the maid. This is ridiculous." Edward scoffed. "If this is about staff severance, we'll handle it privately." "No," Mr. Havorson said. "This is not about severance." He closed the folder, and then he said my name. "Ruth Jackson." My heart skipped, not from surprise, but from memory. Margaret had promised this moment would come. I just hadn't known how. Edward's face hardened. Why is her name being mentioned? The lawyer met his gaze evenly. Because Mrs. Whitfield requested that Ms. Jackson remain present for the entirety of this reading. That's absurd, Claire snapped. She's staff. Mr. Havorson's voice stayed calm. She is listed. Listed. The word hung in the air like smoke. I felt my hands grow warm, not shaking, just alive. Because when you have been dismissed your entire life, recognition doesn't arrive as joy, it arrives as pressure. Edward stepped forward. This is highly inappropriate. Our mother was ill, emotional, easily influenced. I finally looked up. Slowly, deliberately, I met his eyes. And for the first time in 32 years, I did not lower my gaze. The lawyer inhaled. Mrs. Whitfield anticipated that concern, he said, which is why she recorded statements during the drafting of her will. Claire stiffened. Recorded statements? Yes, Mr. Havorson said. Video, audio, and written confirmations, all made while she was deemed fully competent by 3 independent physicians. The whispers began again, but this time they were nervous. I remembered the afternoons Margaret had asked me to sit beside her while she spoke into a small recorder. "Ruth," she'd said softly, "they'll try to say I didn't know what I was doing." "You don't owe me anything," I had told her. She had smiled. "That's exactly why I do." Mr. Havorson turned another page. Mrs. Whitfield requested that the first item be addressed publicly. Edward exhaled sharply. "Fine, let's get this over with." The lawyer cleared his throat. Margaret Whitfield bequeaths the contents of her personal letters, journals, and recorded statements to, he paused, to Ruth Jackson. The air cracked. Claire laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "You're joking." Edward's face flushed. "This is inappropriate. Those are family documents." Mr. Havorson shook his head. "They are personal documents, and Mrs. Whitfield defined personal very clearly." I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, from being seen. Margaret had trusted me with her truth. And now she was placing that truth where it could no longer be erased. Edward stepped closer to the lawyer. "You're letting a maid walk away with my mother's private life?" "No," Mr. Havorson replied evenly. "Your mother already did." The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, waiting, because this was only the beginning. Mr. Havorson closed the folder gently. "This concludes the preliminary reading. The remainder will occur tomorrow morning at the Whitfield residence." Edward looked relieved. Claire looked annoyed. They thought this was over. They thought control had returned. But as people began to disperse, Mr. Havorson turned back to me, quietly, so only I could hear. "She wanted you to know," he said, "that tomorrow will be decisive." I nodded, because I already knew. That night, as I returned to my small apartment, the same one Margaret had helped me keep when money was tight, I placed my keys on the table and sat in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't celebrate. I waited. Because some truths are too large to reveal in a graveyard. They require walls, witnesses, and nowhere left to hide. Tomorrow, they would read the rest. And when they did, the humiliation they gave me would finally find its way back home. If you're feeling the tension rise, like this video, subscribe to Black Diamond's Sleep didn't come easily that night. Not because I was afraid of what would happen next, but because memory has a way of waking up when it knows it's finally going to be heard. I lay on my narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the next room. The same apartment, the same walls, the same life I had returned to after the funeral, yet nothing felt the same. Margaret was gone, but somehow she felt closer than ever. I arrived at the Whitfield house early the next morning, earlier than I was asked to. Old habits die hard. The mansion looked exactly as it always had: white columns, manicured hedges, windows polished so clean they reflected the sky like mirrors. A place designed to impress the world while hiding everything that mattered. I stood at the gate for a moment before ringing the bell. I had walked through those doors thousands of times, but never like this. Never as someone who was about to be heard. Edward opened the door himself. He looked tired, not the grief kind of tired, the losing control kind. He didn't greet me, didn't ask why I was there. He simply stepped aside. "Lawyer's already inside," he said flatly. I nodded and walked past him. For once, I didn't wait for permission. The living room was full. Claire sat stiffly on the couch, arms crossed, her eyes sharp and calculating. Two of Margaret's grandchildren hovered near the windows, uncomfortable, confused, sensing tension they didn't yet understand. Mr. Havorson stood near the fireplace, papers neatly arranged. When he saw me, he gave a small nod, not pity, not politeness, respect. Edward closed the door behind me. "Let's make this quick," he said. "We all have lives to get back to." I looked around the room. Lives built on a woman they barely knew. Mr. Havorson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitfield left very specific instructions for this portion of the will," he said. "She requested that Ms. Jackson be seated." Claire scoffed. "She can stand." The lawyer didn't look at her. "She will sit," he said. There was no argument in his voice, just fact. I took a seat, in Margaret's chair, the one by the window, the one she used to sit in every afternoon with a blanket over her legs and tea cooling beside her. Claire's jaw tightened. Edward's eyes narrowed, but neither of them spoke. Mr. Havorson opened a slim black tablet. "We will begin with a recording," he said. Edward raised a hand. "I object to this circus." "You may object later," the lawyer replied calmly. Mrs. Whitfield anticipated resistance. "This recording is legally binding." He pressed play. Margaret's voice filled the room, clear, steady, stronger than it had been in months. "If you are hearing this," she said, "then I am no longer here to explain myself, which means you are probably angry." Claire stiffened. Edward's face flushed. I closed my eyes, because I had been there when she recorded this. I remembered how she squeezed my hand afterward and said, "They'll finally have to listen." Edward. "Claire," Margaret continued, "I loved you both, but love does not blind me, and motherhood does not erase truth." The room grew very still. "You were raised with privilege, and you confused that with virtue." Edward stood up abruptly. "This is manipulation," he snapped. "She was sick." Margaret's voice didn't pause. "I was not sick when I made my decisions. I was lucid, I was clear, and I was tired of pretending." Claire's voice trembled. "Turn this off." Mr. Havorson didn't move. "For 32 years, Margaret said, Ruth Jackson cared for me when you could not be bothered to visit. She bathed me when I was weak. She listened when I was afraid. She stayed." I felt my throat tighten. She did not stay because she was paid. She stayed because she has character. Edward laughed bitterly. "So now the maid's a saint?" Margaret's voice sharpened. "No, she is a woman, one you underestimated because it was convenient." The grandchildren shifted uncomfortably. They had never heard their grandmother speak like this. None of them had. I have rewritten my will, Margaret said calmly, not to punish, but to correct. Edward's hand slammed onto the table. That's enough. Mr. Havorson raised a finger. Sit down, he said. Edward froze, because authority recognizes authority. And for the first time in his life, Edward Whitfield did not have it. Ruth, Margaret's voice softened. If you are listening to this, then I need you to hear something clearly. My breath caught. I am sorry. The words hit harder than any insult ever had. I am sorry I allowed you to be treated as invisible in my home. I thought kindness was enough. It was not. Tears slid down my face. I didn't wipe them away. Everything I am about to do, Margaret continued, is not charity, it is justice. The recording ended. The room felt smaller, heavier, like the walls themselves were listening. Mr. Havorson spoke quietly. Effective immediately, Margaret Whitfield has placed the Whitfield residence and 1/3 of her liquid assets into a living trust. Edward exhaled sharply. That's still ours. The lawyer looked at him. The beneficiary of that trust is Ruth Jackson. Claire stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. That's impossible. Edward's face went pale. You're lying. Mr. Havorson shook his head. She made this decision 3 years ago. It has been legally protected ever since. I didn't move, I didn't smile, because the truth wasn't about money. It was about something far more dangerous, control, and they were losing it. Edward pointed at me. You planned this. I met his gaze calmly. No, I said, your mother did. The lawyer closed his folder. This concludes today's reading, he said. There is more. Claire's voice cracked. How much more? Mr. Havorson looked at them evenly. Enough to explain why. As he gathered his things, Edward turned to me. You think this makes you one of us? He asked bitterly. I stood slowly, smoothly, with a dignity they could never imitate. No, I said, it makes me something you never were. He stared at me. What's that? I held his gaze. Accountable. When I walked out of that house, the air felt different. Lighter, not because I had won, but because the truth had begun to breathe. If you feel the story tightening around you. Like this video, subscribe to Black Diamonds. There is a moment right after power shifts when people don't scream. They go quiet. That's the moment they are the most dangerous. I felt it the second I stepped outside the Whitfield house. The air was crisp, clean, indifferent. Birds chirped like nothing in the world had changed. But behind me, inside those white walls, something had cracked open that could never be sealed again. And Margaret knew it would. That's why she left more. Mr. Havorson called me later that afternoon. His voice was steady, but there was something careful in it, the tone people use when they are about to say words that cannot be taken back. Ms. Jackson, he said, Mrs. Whitfield instructed me to meet with you privately before the final portion of the will is disclosed. I wasn't surprised. Margaret had always believed truth should arrive in layers. Where? I asked. At the house, he replied. Tomorrow morning, just you and me. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table, Margaret's old teacup resting between my palms. I had taken it years ago when she insisted. You'll think of me, she'd said. I already did, every day. Still, something in my chest felt tight, not fear, preparation. Because deep down, I knew the next truth wouldn't just humiliate her children, it would expose them. The next morning, the house felt different without Edward and Claire. Quieter, less performative. Mr. Havorson sat across from me in the study, the same room where Margaret used to read in the afternoons. He placed a thick envelope on the table between us. "This portion was not meant for public reading," he said. "Mrs. Whitfield wanted you to hear it first." I nodded, my hands were steady. "I'm listening." He opened the envelope slowly. Inside were documents, old ones, yellowed edges, hospital records, legal filings, letters written in a careful, feminine hand, Margaret's. "This," he said, tapping the first page, "is why she trusted you." He slid one document forward, a birth certificate. My breath stopped. Not because I didn't recognize the name, but because I did. Daniel Whitfield. Date of birth 41 years ago. Mother Margaret Whitfield. Father unlisted. I stared at the paper. My mind raced. Edward was 47. Claire was 44. Daniel would have been the forgotten one. The child they never talked about. The child who disappeared from family stories like he had never existed. Mr. Havorson spoke softly. "Margaret gave birth to a son when she was young, before marriage, before wealth, before respectability." I swallowed. "He was black," the lawyer continued. The word landed heavy. Margaret had never said it out loud, but I had known. You don't care for someone for 3 decades without learning where their pain lives. "She was forced to give him up," Mr. Havorson said. "Her family threatened to disown her. The father vanished. Adoption was arranged quietly." My chest tightened. "Where did he go?" I asked. Mr. Havorson met my eyes. "To the foster system." The room felt smaller, colder. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory. "Some mistakes don't disappear, Ruth, they just learn how to hide." "She spent her life trying to make it right," the lawyer continued. "Donations, scholarships, anonymous payments." "And you?" I asked quietly. "Why me?" Mr. Havorson smiled faintly. "Because you helped her find him." The memory rushed back. Years ago, Margaret had asked me to help track down records, adoption files, names, addresses. She had never explained why. She hadn't needed to. "He died," Mr. Havorson said gently. The words cut clean. "He passed away 12 years ago." I closed my eyes. Margaret had known. She had grieved quietly, privately, like all her greatest pains. "But he had a daughter," the lawyer continued. My eyes snapped open. "A daughter?" I whispered. Mr. Havorson nodded. "She was placed into foster care after his death, bounced from home to home." My hands trembled now, not from shock, from recognition. He slid another document across the table, a photograph. A teenage girl with tired eyes and familiar cheekbones. My breath caught because I knew that face. I had known it since she was 6. "That's not possible," I whispered. Mr. Havorson's voice softened. "Margaret insisted on absolute secrecy. She arranged for the child to be placed with a guardian under a different name." The room spun. "You," he said. "You were the guardian." The truth slammed into me, hard, violent, beautiful, ugly, all at once. "You think you hired me by chance," I whispered. Mr. Havorson shook his head. "Number Margaret placed you where you could protect what she couldn't." My chest burned. My daughter. The child I had taken in after my sister's death. The girl Margaret had paid school fees for quietly. The girl who called Margaret Miss M without knowing why she felt safe around her. Margaret hadn't just trusted me, she had built a future through me. "When the final reading happens," Mr. Havorson said, "this truth becomes public." I leaned back slowly. Edward and Claire, their perfect lineage, their polished family name, built on a lie. They humiliated you at the funeral, the lawyer said. Knowing none of this, I exhaled. They humiliated the woman raising their niece, I replied. Mr. Havorson nodded. That evening, Edward called. I didn't answer. Claire sent messages. I didn't read them. Because some truths don't need responses, they need witnesses. The final reading was scheduled for the next morning. All family members present, media waiting outside, Margaret's instructions, Margaret's justice. I stood in front of my mirror that night. I looked older than I used to, stronger too. I adjusted my black dress, lifted my chin, and for the first time in my life, I did not feel small. Because tomorrow, the family who humiliated the black maid at the funeral would learn who she really was, and why Margaret Whitfield had trusted her with everything. If your chest feels tight right now, like this video, subscribe to Black Diamond's Truth does not enter a room gently. It arrives like a mirror suddenly uncovered and forces everyone to see what they have avoided for years. The Whitfield house was surrounded by cars when I arrived that morning. Black sedans, news vans, familiar faces pretending they weren't afraid. Margaret had been clear about this too. If they are to learn the truth, she had told me once, they will learn it in the light. Inside, the living room felt tighter than before. Edward paced near the fireplace, jacket still on, jaw clenched. Claire sat rigidly on the couch, her phone face down, her composure cracking at the edges. Extended family members whispered among themselves, cousins who had never visited Margaret, uncles who remembered her only when money was involved. And then there was her, my daughter, standing near the window. Quiet, unaware, she had been invited under the pretense of family matters. Margaret's final protection. My heart clenched. Mr. Havorson waited until everyone was seated, until the room was full, until there was no escape. Then he spoke. Mrs. Whitfield requested that this portion of the will be read aloud in the presence of all direct and indirect heirs. Edward exhaled sharply. Let's proceed. He still thought this was about money. That was his mistake. The lawyer opened the final folder. Margaret Whitfield acknowledged that her greatest failure was not love, but fear. Claire rolled her eyes. Spare us. Mr. Havorson didn't look at her. 41 years ago, he continued, Margaret Whitfield gave birth to a son. The room froze. Edward stopped pacing. Claire's head snapped up. What? Claire whispered. A son? Edward repeated. That's impossible. Mr. Havorson's voice remained calm. The child was born out of wedlock and interracial. Gasps, sharp, uncontrolled. Margaret's secret stepped fully into the room. Edward's face drained of color. You're lying. Mr. Havorson shook his head. He was named Daniel. Silence slammed down, because the name meant nothing to them, but it meant everything to me. He was placed into the foster system under pressure from Margaret's family, the lawyer continued. Margaret spent the rest of her life attempting to protect and provide for him from a distance. Claire stood abruptly. This is insane. Edward laughed, but it cracked halfway through. You expect us to believe this now, after everything? The lawyer turned and looked at me. Ms. Jackson, he said gently, would you please stand? My heart pounded, but I stood. Slowly, deliberately. This woman, Mr. Havorson said, was not just Margaret Whitfield's maid. Edward sneered. Oh, please. She was Margaret's most trusted confidant, the lawyer continued. And the legal guardian of Daniel Whitfield's child. The room exploded. What? No, that's not, Claire's voice broke. Edward stumbled backward. I turned toward my daughter. Her eyes met mine, confused, searching. Mom, she whispered. I walked to her, took her hands. This is the part I was protecting you from, I said softly. Mr. Havorson raised a document. Margaret Whitfield's biological granddaughter is Ava Jackson. My daughter, their blood, their inheritance. Edward shouted. This is a setup. Claire collapsed back onto the couch. She's black, she whispered, and there it was, the truth beneath the truth. Yes, Mr. Havorson said calmly, she is. Ava looked at me. Is it true? She asked quietly. I nodded. Your grandfather loved you, I said. Your grandmother never stopped trying to find her way back to you. Tears filled her eyes. The lawyer continued. Margaret Whitfield amended her will accordingly. Ava Jackson is recognized as a legal heir. Edward slammed his fist on the table. This destroys everything. Mr. Havorson nodded once. Yes, he said. That was the point. Money, property, legacy. Everything Edward thought belonged to him shifted in that instant. The Whitfield name no longer belonged to one image, one color, one lie. And finally, the lawyer said, Margaret left instructions regarding the public narrative. He turned toward the window. The press is waiting. Edward's breath came fast. You wouldn't dare. Mr. Havorson met his gaze. She already did. The doorbell rang, once, twice. The sound of truth asking to be let in. I looked at Edward, at Claire, at the people who humiliated me at a funeral, who whispered while I grieved, who thought silence meant weakness. You took my dignity that day, I said calmly. You don't get to take my daughter's future too. The doors opened. Cameras flashed. Questions filled the air. And Margaret Whitfield's truth finally stepped into the world. If you're still with me, like this video, subscribe to Black Diamond's Truth Doesn't End a Story. It begins the reckoning. The cameras outside the Whitfield house flashed like lightning trapped in glass. Reporters shouted questions that had waited decades to be asked. Is it true Margaret Whitfield had a secret son? Who is the young girl named in the will? Did the family know? Edward stood frozen near the doorway, his face pale, his legacy slipping through his fingers while the world watched. Claire had disappeared upstairs. Running has always been easier than accountability. I held Ava close as we stepped forward. She trembled not from fear, but from the weight of history settling on her shoulders. I leaned down and whispered, You don't owe anyone anything, just stand. She nodded and stood. Mr. Havorson addressed the press with calm authority. Margaret Whitfield made her final wishes clear. Her granddaughter, Ava Jackson, is a lawful heir. This decision is final. A reporter pushed forward. Ms. Jackson, how long have you known? I met the camera's eye. Long enough to know silence protects the wrong people. The Whitfield name began unraveling within hours. Sponsors withdrew. Board members resigned. Old allies suddenly forgot Edward's number. The same society that once praised him now treated him like a liability. And I watched it happen quietly, not with joy, with justice. That evening, Ava and I returned to the small house Margaret had left us, not the mansion, but the truth-filled one by the river. A place meant for beginnings, not appearances. Ava sat at the kitchen table, staring at the documents. She knew me, Ava said softly. She watched you grow, I replied. She just didn't know how to be brave soon enough. Ava swallowed. Did she love me? I smiled sadly. She loved you enough to tell the truth in the end. The funeral humiliation replayed in my mind that night, the whispers, the looks, the way I stood alone beside the coffin while they pretended I was invisible. Now the same people were calling, apologizing, explaining I didn't answer. Closure does not require conversation. A week later, Edward showed up. No cameras, no witnesses, just a man stripped of certainty. I didn't know, he said hoarsely. I know, I replied. That's what made it easier for you. He looked past me at Ava. I lost everything. I met his gaze. No, I said calmly, you lost control. Ava stepped forward. I don't want revenge, she said. I want space to become who I am. Edward nodded, tears slipping free. And for the first time, I saw something human behind his entitlement. But humanity does not erase harm. It only acknowledges it. Months passed. Ava began using her full name. Ava Whitfield Jackson, not because she needed the name, but because it no longer scared her. She spoke at schools, shared her story, and every time she stood on a stage, she stood taller than the shame meant to silence her. As for me, I left domestic work, not out of bitterness, but out of completion. Margaret once told me, you were never meant to stay invisible. She was right. On the anniversary of Margaret's death, Ava and I returned to her grave. No whispers, no judgment, just peace. Ava placed flowers down gently. Thank you, she whispered, not for money, not for blood, but for truth. I stood beside my daughter, the world quiet around us. And I realized something powerful. They humiliated the black maid at the funeral. But they could never bury the truth. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe to Black Diamonds.